there was, again, a lot of things that I was confronted with for the first time. I think, well, I won't put it in my words. Tell us a little bit about the book itself.
Great. Okay, so the book covers the stages of life, the life cycle of enslaved people as commodities and as human beings. I look at them as products and as people. And a lot of the work that's been done on enslaved people and their values has been sort of sprinkled through history books where they'll say the price of somebody sort of as a background information, but it's rarely contextualized. So I wanted to write a book that told the readers what these values mean. And as I was working on it, I realized that there's another value and that no one had really asked what the enslaved people knew about their values. Did they care about their prices? Did they know? How did they participate in auction sales? Did they disrupt them? And so I look at the life cycle. Each chapter goes through a stage of life, from birth, actually from preconception, through death and then beyond. And I look at their bodies as treated as a commodity and how they rejected, responded, and sort of dealt with the idea of being a product and a person in the same body.
And now these prices they get so detailed as you read through. I mean, there's an example is younger women, their menstrual cycles have an impact on their pricing. I mean, it's amazing just the level of detail as to how, I mean, even their personality, whether they were a singer, whether they danced, and it paints such a frightening picture of humanity, and yet you have this price tag attached.
Yes.
And how was it finding out that information, for one? I felt like you really got some fantastic figures. At the beginning of each chapter, you have, I believe it's the value and then the average set price for each age group. How did you go about researching that?
I'm actually glad you asked, because lately I've been talking about the book, and some of my graduate students have been at these presentations, and they said, you didn't even tell them about all the research you did. And I get so caught up in the stories because I'm really interested in the people. But essentially I started collecting data, and created a database of enslaved people's values, their monetary values that were placed on their bodies. And there were two values that I found: the sale price, which is the market value. And then I also saw that there were appraisals that were done annually. So enslaved, people that owned slaves had to have a catalog of the values of their laborers and for tax purposes. So there's these ledger books that have name, age, sex, and then appraised value. And so if you're looking at different plantation records, you can sort of track over time, if you have more than 1 year, on how these values either increase or decrease. So I was going to archives, more than 20 archives throughout the South, for about 6 years, and just going and looking for any document outside of even these ledger books, but any document that was a bill of sale that had price information. I was wanting market sales, but I kept finding more and more appraisal records. So I created an Excel spreadsheet, and I was just basically doing data entry. And midway in this process, I did a talk while I was on fellowship at Duke, and there was an economic historian in the audience named Stanley Engerman. He and Robert Fogel wrote a book in 1974 called Time on the Cross, and it was an economic history of slavery. Very controversial study, because they did not look at the value of, they didn't look at the enslaved people as humans. They just focused on
just the economics.
Just the economics. Like, this is how profitable it was to have an enslaved labor. This is how many times on average they were whipped. And it was a very important study. And it was controversial at the time, but it was important because it opened up a whole new canon of scholarship for us to study.
Now, Daina, why was it controversial at the time? Because it didn't put any of the these are people element into it.
Exactly. That's exactly why. Now, and it was also a new field, the cliometric fields of looking at like numbers and understanding how we can use databases to tell and understand history. So they were cataloging. So basically, instead of looking at an enslaved person named Mingo, they would put a dot on a graph and show like these are the average. So people became figures and objects as opposed to people. And so, and it was right in the heart, it was like right after the civil rights movement that this was written. So there was a lot of uproar about the book, but it was also a huge contribution to what we know and understand and how we think about the profitability of slavery. So, and this is what I always, teach my students, like, what can you gain out of a book? Even if you may not agree with the tone or some of the findings, like what in here is new that we can learn and advance our understanding of the past?
Well, I mean, Daina, I was educated in the, Texas public school system. I didn't know any of this stuff. And so as I was reading it, I mean, just all of the emotions that came through. I mean, you would have to, these were people doing this to other people. And, I mean, the book is so dramatic. It's so emotional. And, but I was astounded because I knew none of this. And I felt, at once awful for not knowing this, but it's not our fault for not knowing this because we're not given this information.
No. And I have students in college now where I teach, say like, why didn't we learn this before? I've never learned this. And I have
what's the answer to that?
The answer is it needs to be in textbooks, and textbooks are very political, particularly in this state. And what gets put in a textbook and what doesn't get put in a textbook. Also is we've been since like the early 90s in a phase of looking at microhistories where we're going into looking at counties and plantations and families and, just sort of micro aspects of history. And we're now incorporating that into a larger context. So we're looking at we're bringing this like micro history into a larger context so we can have a broader understanding. But we're sort of just beginning this. And people always say like, is there more to study? There's so much more about slavery we haven't even learned. And as a country, we have yet to talk about it as much. And we just have a lot more to learn about the institution.
Do you think people are scared to talk about it?
Yes.
Because it's so uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable. It's painful. Some people feel guilty. Some people feel angry. Some people are ashamed. And oftentimes people don't know how they're going to react to this material. And it is emotional. It's very emotional. And it's American history.
And I think that's what the book did such a great job at doing, is that you have those hard facts, you have that data, and yet every chapter starts with a story and it ends with a story. And so you take it from, the larger picture to the very, very personal in such a short space of time, so that you have that there to support the science and the data, but it's not negating that humanistic element and saying that these are people's stories that we're talking about.
Well, and that was what I was trying to do, was balance, because we do have, since Fogel and Engerman published Time on the Cross in 1974, there's been a number of other economic histories of slavery that we've learned a lot about how much it costs to maintain, a small plantation, how much do they need to buy in food, and how much what kind of clothing and shoes, supplies. We can look at like how a planter can be profitable. But what was missing from my perspective was, okay, so I understand this and I agree. Enslaved people were products. How did they respond and what did they think? How did they react? What is their contribution to this discussion? And why haven't we asked that question? And a lot of the answers were, well, we don't have that information. We don't know what they thought. But if you dig in through some of the same records that we use to look at the profitability, look at the institution of slavery as a whole, the answers and the voices of the enslaved were sprinkled all over all these records. And so I looked for the most, some of the quotes in here are from sources that people are very familiar with. Some of them I've dug up and found in old newspapers, and it just happened to be an article that was describing an auction, and there was a quote from an enslaved person. And I love to have allow their voices to be in the text. And if I have their names, I'm going to say their names, because a lot of times people talk about them as products, which they were, and they were raised to think of themselves as commodities, but they were also human beings that had emotions, that have loved ones, that had an opinion about who they were sold to, who they were not sold to. And I wanted to try to put that in there. So when I was saying about the data, when I met Stanley Engerman, this was around 2007, and he heard a talk that I gave that I was writing about slave suicide. And I was looking at when enslaved people committed suicide on the eve of their sales. So some of them did not want to be sold, or they did not want to be separated from their families, so they committed suicide. Not a whole lot, but it was really heart-wrenching history. And there's a scholar named Terry Snyder who writes about it, and she just came out with a book about it. At any rate, so I presented about enslaved people's values and how they valued their lives, and they made choices of when they were going to die. And that was the way that I argue in this book, that they expressed, a certain internal value that they had for themselves. So he comes up to me after the talk and he says, listen, you're working on a book that, we wanted to write 30 years ago, and I've been waiting for 30 years for someone to write this book. And I was like, really? And he said, I have some data for you. And so he donated all of the records that they had from probate or will records from a number of plantations throughout the South that had appraisals. And so I combined that with my data set. And at one point I had like 90,000 individual sale and appraisal records, which is what the data at the top of the chapter. It kind of gets buried now. Yeah. At any rate. And so I had that information, then I had to clean it for like 3 or 4 years. I was cleaning the data, like making sure there weren't duplicates, enslaved people in there, because we had gone to some of the same archives. And at one point, am I ever going to get through this? What
a job.
It was a lot of work. It was.
Oh my gosh.
It was a lot of work. And then we made conversions to, I worked with scholars that knew how to make economic conversions to look at interest over time. So all the figures in the book are in $1860. So we can look at a slave person from Maryland in 1830 and someone from Virginia in 1850, and the numbers, when I'm talking about them, they're comparable. And then I thought it was more important also for today's value to look at what that means in 2014, 2015, dollars. So I put that in there, and that really drives the point home. But I think a lot of people were waiting for this book to talk all about numbers. But I got sidetracked as someone who was interested in the people, and I realized that the enslaved people could care less about their values, about their monetary values, and that they really cared about who they were with, who they were sold to, whether they could be with their partners or their children. And there was a way that they survived this institution and this commodification, and that was to cling on to the value of their soul, which is what I call soul values.
I love that, the word it is called soul value, spirit or soul values.
Yeah.
And it's just so, to read that is kind of like a little spark of something when you're going through. It's kind of like this is someone we're talking about. This is not an appraised product.
Exactly.
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take a very short break. We're speaking here with Daina Ramey Berry about her book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. This is Writing on the Air. We'll be back after these messages. And welcome back. You are listening to Writing on the Air. Writing in the air, writing on the air.
However we do it.
However we're doing it, we're writing. Here at Co-op 91.7 FM, we're speaking with our guest today, Daina Ramey Berry, about her book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. Now, I think the way it's set up, the book, I found the book format so engaging, just to begin with. I wouldn't use the word love very hesitantly there, but the way it's set up into the generational elements, the age groups, it's heartbreaking. I think for me, one of the sections that really stood out was about the childbearing women. And there's just one, I had to read this, it's a line from the book, "The law sanctioned slavery through a woman's womb." And it was, I had never heard about that and never thought about that. And yet, of course, I mean, when you think about it as an economic system, tell us a little bit about that part of the book, about women continuing on slavery through the birth of children. Yeah,
it's an interesting sort of twist, isn't it? That their bodies are populating the system of the institution of slavery. Prior to 1808 in the United States, the primary source of enslaved laborers was direct imports from Africa or from the Caribbean by way of Africa. And when the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in the United States in 1808, it was more important to continue populating the institution. And one way was through natural or forced reproduction. So enslaved women were valued even before the transatlantic slave trade closed, but it was really in the late 18th century that traders and enslavers in what became the United States learned that they could grow the institution through women. So legislation as early as 1662 and 1663 in Maryland and Virginia stated that the status of the slave was defined by the mother. Mm-hmm. So if the mother was an enslaved person and she gave birth, it doesn't matter if she has one child or 7 children, that they would be enslaved. It didn't matter what the race of the father was. It didn't matter the paternal line. Mm-hmm. So when I first started doing this research, my dissertation in graduate school was on female slavery. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking that, okay, women have to be priced higher during their childbearing years because they're the ones, through the legislation and through their bodies, the system of slavery is maintained here. And I did find plantations in Georgia, which was what I used to study, that had, women priced higher during their childbearing years. And I wanted to know, was that a national trend? Mm-hmm. And I found out it wasn't. And I was surprised. Oh. And it turns out these were outlier plantations in a very small community on the St. Simon's Island, Georgia. So it was an isolated island community. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the husbands or planters were away on business or politics. And so the plantations a number of them were run by their wives. And I think that perhaps because they were mothers, they had given birth, maybe they were, I don't know this for a fact, but this is what I speculate, and that maybe that's why these values were a little bit higher. Mm-hmm. We have a diary from one of the ladies who slave women came to them all the time asking for, respite after labor, and wanting, saying, I'm having all these children, I'm exhausted. And so they would try to negotiate a little bit of space. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, maybe that's why. But across the board, enslaved men were priced higher than women, even during the childbearing years.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's astounding just how the women themselves are aware of the process as well. I know there's a couple of quotes from women, one of them saying, the more children I have, the more that she's able to then kind of go on and be sold, and her value, her external value is recognized more on the outside. And that you touch a little bit in the book on how the enslaved people themselves view certain eras of their lives. Mm-hmm. And I think one that really stood out for me was when you get into the elderly, and here elderly is 40 yes. and above. Yes. We would think that's kind of a midlife, but at that time it was life elderly. Yeah. And there's an example that you use. I think it's
is it my favorite? Is it Isaac?
Is it Ponto?
Ponto is great. Ponto is great too.
Ponto, and it was kind of trying to figure out why he was purposely trying to drive down his market value. And one of the reasons was simply that he was so aware of the system that he just didn't want any part in it anymore.
Exactly.
And it's amazing, just the stories and how you can go about viewing these people within the system, and just like any other person, they have their own way of viewing themselves and viewing the system.
And that's what's been missing from the historical literature. Mm-hmm. So we haven't really had that many scholars that talked about, outside of there's a scholar named Walter Johnson. There are scholars that write about the domestic slave trade. Calvin Schimmerhorn, who's at Arizona State, Walter Johnson at Harvard, and a number of others, Ed Baptist at Cornell, who talk about enslaved people disrupting their sales, mm-hmm. Trying to manipulate their sales. And these kinds of conversations started around 1999, 2000. So we're really sort of in a space that I would say is discovery, and we're now looking at what enslaved people did. And so I'm glad you caught that, because I wanted people to see that this awareness of themselves as commodities evolves. Mm-hmm. And the chapter on the elderly was very important, because all slave price studies, outside of one team of scholars, focuses on prime male slaves. Mm-hmm. Those were individuals between 18 and 30. And that was it. So there were very few people that even thought about women's prices or values. No one talked about the elderly because they had zero value, or their values were so low that it didn't have an impact on the larger economic aspects of the institution. But because I wasn't just interested in that, I found that the elderly were the most valued members of the enslaved community.
Yes.
And so that's it's a complete flip from the economic or financial, fiscal, market, monetary value. And so even though they might have had a zero value on their bodies in the ledger books or on the price sheets, you know, they were the people that in that community held it together. They were the rocks of that community. They were the foundations of the community.
And in that very chapter, there's another story from an enslaved man who, instead of becoming resigned to the system, actually says, I want to escape the system. Like, he came to an awareness of, I'm better off running for my life and leaving the system. And I think that idea of, and you do touch on that awareness at every stage. I think one of the more difficult to read chapters was regarding infants and young children. And you do remark about how well they were, I mean, in this case, almost absolutely no knowledge of what they were inside in terms of the system. And at each chapter, you pose that question to that age group. How much do you know about what it is that you're a part of? How much do you know about where your mother will go or the prices attached to yourself and so forth? How did you go about researching the one for the infants and children? I think it begins with such a heart-wrenching story.
Yeah. One, I was looking at, I started off looking at the values of women just in general because I had looked at this women in their childbearing years. And then I found a cemetery record that had burial records of some cemeteries in urban communities where planters paid money to bury, you know, I guess maybe highly valued enslaved people because they're paying money to bury them. And so it had a list of like some of the illnesses and diseases, and there were all these babies that were stillborn or that crib death, smothered. You know, I kept seeing that, and sometimes the mother that they died in childbirth. And so I was really fascinated. So I started studying that and then studying medical records to try to understand how are women priced, because very few scholars had looked at that. So I wanted to know, how are women valued, and the space where they were most valued was during their childbearing years. And then I had to think about, what about the women that disrupted their pregnancies by self-aborting, by, eating certain things, by trying to make sure they didn't get pregnant or terminating pregnancies. And so that was where I sort of started finding that material. And there's some scholars that have written about that relating to slave health. So I found it in there. But the mothers and the babies, there were so many enslaved adults that had their recollections of sales of the wailings of mothers when they were separated from their children, sometimes at their breast. And that was just, I couldn't write about it.
Reading that, Daina, it was, you know, the memories that these adults had that haunted them for their lives, and you know, like one in particular, or a few, that it was their earliest memory of either when they were taken from their mother's arms or seeing it happen to their siblings.
Exactly.
And yeah, I mean, how did you get through all of this material and write it?
Yeah, I've had that question a lot, and actually, since the book's only been out about 3 weeks, I've done a few readings, and a couple of times when I finished, I felt guilty because half the audience was in tears, and I get it because I've been there. Writing it was very hard. It was extremely hard. It took 10 years. I had to go into a sort of a cave a little bit. Some days I didn't feel like being social. Some days I had trouble being social.
Because it was just so heavy.
It was heavy, and it was depressing. But I do gain strength from the spirit and the stories of the people who survived. And I see them still loving. I see them still caring, still searching. I see them still living. And that gave me hope to keep moving forward and to tell these stories. And I also felt like a lot of these stories haven't been told. And I felt like I need to keep going and put it in here. But no, I had to exercise, watch mindless television shows, take my dog on a walk, do stuff with my son and just hug him, spend time with my husband, go to movies, go to comedy shows, find laughter, try to find spaces of levity, because what I do for the majority of the day is heavy, heavy work.
Daina, one of the parts about the book that just got to me was I loved your preface where you tell about yourself and your own history and the just incredibly blessed childhood that you had.
Exactly.
And would you want to tell us a little bit about your history?
Yeah. I want to say though about the preface, I appreciate you appreciating it because that was very open for me. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I'm a private person, but I've never been that revealing in such a public way in my published work. And I published other books and reference volumes and articles and all that. But I felt like that somebody had asked me during the process, like, how did you think about this in terms of valuation and devaluation? And that's really what I focused in on for the book. And it's like, well, I've experienced, I'm not saying that I'm enslaved at all, but I understood the flip-flop, that sort of pendulum that I see within the slave community where they have love and support and their family is there. And then the fear of like the next day going out and maybe being sold. And so, I wrote a very, very personal, opening preface, and I had an editor read it, not from the press, but, external editor. And they said, you need to throw that out and don't put it in there. Like, that is ridiculous. You sound like you're treating yourself like you're a slave and you're trying to over relate to these people. And I think you absolutely should not include that.
Huh.
And I was like, okay, and that was the first person I showed it to. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking, oh my gosh. So I sent it to my mother and I said, Mom, do you think I should not put this in there? And she was like, no, I absolutely think you should. Mm-hmm. She's like, because I think it tells people always want to know why authors write the books that they write. Mm-hmm. And this is a great way of showing that. So for me, my history with slavery, as I look at how I evolved and grew, I grew up not wanting to talk about slavery. I'm African American. I grew up not wanting to look at this history, although I learned a lot about, as you could see from my parents educating me and like the community. I knew a lot about history, but in school, I was, in a predominantly white school in a very privileged community, and people would stare at me. I had students ask me, well, what was it like when you were a slave? Like, they just assumed I was a slave, And my dad said, and I don't always tell this story, but my dad said I came home at like 5 or 6 and said, Daddy, what was it like to be a slave? Oh, wow. Like I thought, okay, I wasn't, but maybe my dad was,
Yeah.
And so over the years we went on family trips every year. We visited all kinds of places, and my parents taught us about all kinds of people and aspects of American history. And so I had this really fond love of history, but then I would go places and be treated differently. Mm-hmm. And it was like this sort of pendulum of being valued in certain settings and not in others. And I thought, maybe this is some of that I'm seeing, and I'm just going to be open and tell people why I wrote this.
Yeah.
And you do make mention of that's still an issue in modern America, is the commodification of the African American. I mean, I thought it was when you talked about you mentioned the Black Lives Matter, and then you said Black bodies matter, and it really brings home because the book is it's about the physical body, and yet you have all of that's behind it. Yes. But oftentimes just that physicality is the thing that's on everyone's mind or that's presented.
And the historical context of why this book of yours is so important now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. I was actually worried. Somebody asked me if I put those phrases in there, just recently. The front matter of the book was written 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think it's still relevant. And I was worried that it wasn't going to be relevant. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is not going to be relevant, But I knew that this was the book that I wanted to write. And I always tell my graduate students, you write the book that you want to write. And figure out what it is, tell your reader what you're writing, and write that book. Mm-hmm. And be very clear about what it is that you're writing. And so that's one of the reasons why I said I'm going to go forward and just explain to people why I'm writing this book, and why, as somebody who does work on slavery and capitalism, was always disturbed that we're talking about enslaved people as dots on graphs and statistics. And that dot is a man named Ponto who might have had a wife somewhere, or it's a person named Isaac whose wife cares about him, or it's a woman named Merlinda, or it's another enslaved person whose brother was sold and they recognize the money on the table was their brother, that's the kind of stories that I felt like were missing. And they're peppered through the books that we read and the narratives. And I thought, I want to do the best that I can to try to think about this history so that we're not talking about enslaved people only as commodities, that we can talk about them as commodities and as people, because that's how they understood themselves. And I think I wanted to give license to that. Like, I wanted scholars to feel like it's okay for us to talk about an enslaved person as a commodity, because that's exactly how they were treated. But let's also look at them as human beings, as people who loved and laughed and cried and mourned and danced and married and, not divorced, but like separated, were separated. All of these things that make people human. I'm not saying that we're denying their humanity, because they were always human. But I'm saying let's talk about it in the face of their economic value as well.
And within a system that's so entrenched, you talk about life insurance, and you talk about how every part of their body was in some sense regulated, commodified, and so forth. We're speaking with Daina Ramey Berry about her book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. We're going to take a quick break for some short station messages. Writing on the Air, we'll be right back. And welcome back. You're listening to Writing on the Air here at Co-op 91.7 FM. I'm Lisa Online, one of your co-hosts this evening. We have Martha Louise Hunter here with us in studio, and our guest, Daina Ramey Berry, speaking about her book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. Now, there's a topic that we haven't covered just yet, and this is what you mention in the book. You give the kind of the no more ghost values.
Yes.
And this was probably one of the most shocking parts of the book, is that the commodification of enslaved people did not end at their death.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So when I was looking at the values across every, the stages of life, that's the arc that I used to write the book. I first found that in chapter 4, when I talk about some enslaved people that were, killed by the state or hung because of a crime, their enslavers were then given compensation. The state paid them compensation. And I thought, my goodness, this is somebody who's dead. They're valued, and then the state gives them compensation for their death. So that's almost a form of reparations, which is a big buzzword. But I'm just saying that it's even in the literature at the time, it says that planters were paid reparations. So you sometimes see that word.
So the owners were being paid by the state because
their property.
They lost their property.
Exactly. So it's like if your house burned down and you had insurance on it, you were given money for that, right?
But I think the key thing here is that the owners were receiving this money as opposed to any direct descendants or family members.
Exactly. And so what's interesting about that, though, is that sometimes there was a case that was involved with the execution. So maybe someone was suing somebody, or one person's enslaved labor killed another, and because of that they were murdered. So some of these cases went to court, and there was a valuation at death, and then if the case took 5, 6, 7 years, sometimes there was interest. So the price on the body plus 7 years interest, or 8 years interest. And I thought, wait a minute. Then that means the values of their bodies extend beyond their lives into postmortem spaces. And I thought I just worked with a scholar, and I came up with this term, ghost values. And so then I started thinking, okay, I want to look at all the enslaved people that I know died and find out what happens to them. And so that's how I started going down that rabbit hole. And when I went down that rabbit hole, I started finding that there was an illegal underground market in cadavers, just like there is today in body parts and organs, right?
Yeah.
And so I found that they were selling enslaved bodies and other unclaimed bodies, like whites, criminals, people that had died in almshouses and so forth. It wasn't just enslaved people, but because I'm a scholar of slavery, I was interested in the formerly enslaved bodies. And so I found that they were part of this domestic cadaver trade. And there was letters and papers and writings back and forth all over the North and the South looking for bodies that they were then sold to medical schools to use for anatomical dissection. And that's the part that I think we are just at the tip of the iceberg for, that I just scratched the surface on this. And I knew it was a needle in the haystack when I started looking, but there's a whole history out there, and I'm hoping that graduate students go in this direction, because the question is, what happens to the body at death?
Yeah.
Are they buried? This is prior to cremation. You know, a lot of these stories was prior to the American Medical Association, so medicine wasn't regulated in the way it was. It wasn't professionalized, and it wasn't illegal to do dissections, to perform dissections in university settings. But how you procured the body had regulation, and it was not necessarily regulated in terms of federally regulated mostly until the 1880s. There's some evidence a little bit earlier than that, like the 1830s in some states, 1860s. But for the most part, it was really the 1880s when this whole ring of grave robbing, body snatching, trading was discovered.
And it's really, I mean, it's difficult to read because you wonder where this, I mean, of course, there's very little sanctity you can see in how they were treated, but you almost think as a human that there's some being,
or you think there should
sacred,
be some ending.
There's something
Yes.
sacred about death, whether regardless of how your life was lived or purchased or so forth.
Exactly.
And yet this kind of took that even beyond.
It's almost like, you know, when you pop a balloon, you let the air out, or and you watch it sort of dissipate. I feel like that's what this part of the story does. It's like you've already been sort of your stomach is already turning over, and then you get to that and you're just like, oh my goodness. And so that was actually about 3.5 years of research just to sort of outline the trade, identify specific schools, specific doctors, finding documents that showed this history. And I wanted to put it in there because now I realize if I'm looking at the value of the body is valued before they were born through their mother's uterus and the projections of how many children they can have, and after they died as part of this domestic cadaver trade. And so that's why the scope, and we don't have a term for it, but I feel like we need to come up with a term to think about life cycle, because it's not really life, because it's afterlife. So what does this mean? How do we talk about this kind of valuation in this long stretch, not of time, but just of the body as a cadaver, and, you know, before it's a fetus.
And you have this, in your kind of afterword, you have the phrase legacy of souls and ghosts in circulation. And I felt like that was so important, that covered both the elements. It covered the people you couldn't find out any more about them because there was no physical evidence left behind, or you didn't know where that went. And that's incorporating that and acknowledging that part as well. The ghost part too, which was so important.
And it's interesting because even just this past October, we learned more about Nat Turner. I write about Nat Turner in chapter 4, and I did a piece in the New York Times about his skull that I had traced. And I had traced his skull. National Geographic is now think that they might have identified and located his bone fragments.
Wow.
So that's why I'm saying, like, we're still, these legacies of ghosts and souls is still almost hovering, or it's still here.
It's still there.
It's right in front of us
yes.
still.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the part in the book about that when his wife was sold, or was
well? So what we know about Nat Turner was when he was hung, he was decapitated afterwards, and his skull was then sent to all kind of medical schools throughout the South. And I identified a few schools where students talked about having read his skull, like looking at it, measuring it, and so forth. There's discrepancies over his wife because there are 3 different women that historians have written about that might have been his wife. But there's a narrative that I use from a descendant of one of the 3 women that people are claiming might have been his wife. And I argue that he could have had more than one wife, not to say he was polygamous, but there was serial marriages within slavery. When people were sold and traded, they were partnered up. And he did live at 3 different estates, and there were 3 different women that were owned by these 3 different estates. Yeah. So I'm postulating that could be the case. So this is a descendant of one of these wives' lines, and she has stories to tell about what happened to his children after he was gone. And the descendants now have been in possession of the skull, and they're doing DNA testing to see if we actually have the skull of Nat Turner.
Okay. We love to talk on the program a little bit about how writers construct their work, how they sit down and write. And I mean, with such a huge project like this, something that's 10 years in the making, something that involves so much research, how did you have that dedication and discipline to kind of sit down and actually write it out? I mean, I could imagine it would have started as a huge draft that then had to be cut down.
So I write as an outliner. I'm a big fan of outlining. So I do outlines for the master project. Then I'll do outlines for each chapter. And I also have what I call brainstorming pages for every chapter. And so sometimes I'll do free writing exercises. I write every day. And I'll do a free writing exercise in the morning on that chapter or maybe multiple chapters. And I'm just writing like stream of consciousness, thoughts, words, phrases, not necessarily going and looking up quotes and being exact, but just kind of getting the flow of things. So I do that every day. And then I go back to that outline and I keep outlining to the point where a chapter outline, let's say it's a 40-page chapter, that chapter outline might be 17 pages because what I do is I start putting in the topic sentences and then I bring in the evidence. Like these are the primary documents I'm going to use to make this particular argument, next paragraph. And I do that so that when I actually sit down to write the chapter, more than half of it's finished. It's almost like linking the ideas together. It's almost like I'm writing in transitions and I'm filling in the spaces of these arguments. And then I go back over. And I'm one of those writers that I just need to get a draft out, and my first drafts aren't anything I'd want to share with anybody.
Well, who would?
Yeah. But then I write, and I just edit, I just keep cleaning it up, and then I share it with colleagues and friends and get feedback. So that's just sort of a general, when I was writing the book, I had several years of fellowship, so I had years off. But that was used mostly for the data crunching part, and the actual written part came in the last couple of years where I was working in the mornings. I wrote from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. every day.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've got to say again, the book was so personal and yet that balance that you made between getting that research and getting those facts and historical figures in there, and yet it was so engaging reading. I wanted to find out about all of the stories, and leading with a story for me was so poignant. I felt like it framed the entire chapter. It framed the way of looking at the facts. It kind of put a human face to the facts as well, which is so important.
That's exactly what I wanted to do. So I'm glad it was effective for you as a reader.
Yeah.
And I wanted to make sure that we knew these people, we knew their names, we knew their stories.
Definitely. And tell us a little bit about where the book is available and whether it's I could imagine in many places here in Austin.
Yeah. So it's available at Book People. It's available online. I like to support independent bookstores as well as Amazon and all the other stuff. But so any of the online independent bookstores are selling it. Locally, Book People. And I also will have more information about the book and about the data. I'm going to actually make the data that I collected available online on my website.
Fantastic. What's that website
It's just my name, Dr. Daina Ramey Berry.com.
You better spell that.
Oh, yeah, you're right. DAINARAMEYBERRY.com.
And going through all this research, was there one story that really stood out for you among all the voices that you encountered?
Isaac. And anyone that's seen any of my book talks, it's been about Isaac, who was an enslaved male who was in the elderly chapter, who was taken into custody because he was going to lead a rebellion. And they were going to hang him and a number of others for this rebellion. And while they were on the gallows, he kept trying to take the fall for the he didn't want anyone else to be hung. He said, be men and die like men, and he jumped to his death as opposed to letting them pull the lever. And then the others that were with him did the same thing. And that was, to me, the strongest expression of his soul value at his end of his life.
And I really, again, have got to mention the soul value was such a hard-hitting idea for me. I know one of the stories where it was the gentleman who was purchasing back his son.
Yes.
And he was just short of the right amount of money, and yet somehow he was able to get it together through other people.
Two bystanders helped him out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just stories like that I had absolutely no idea about. It's just, I feel like it's a must read for anyone out there.
Thank you.
Well, that we've been speaking today with Daina Ramey Berry about her book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. Thank you so much, Daina, for coming on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Many enslaved adults recalled horrific experiences on the auction block. Charles Ball was 4 years old when separated from his mother. On the day of his sale, he was naked and never owned any clothes. His new owner dressed him, but Ball vividly recalled that his poor mother, who knew it might be the last time she saw her son, ran after him. She took him down from the horse and held him tight, then wept loudly and bitterly over him. When it was time for him to leave, she walked alongside the road beside the horse, pleading with the owner not to take her son. After being physically separated, his mother was whipped, and Ball remembered the cries of my poor parent as they became less audible the further he traveled. Despite the fading sounds of her cries, and as young as I was, Ball explained, the horrors of that day sank deeply into my heart, and even at this time, though a half-century has elapsed, the terrors of the scene return with painful vividness.
That was Daina Ramey Berry reading from her compelling new book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, The Value of the Enslaved from Womb to Grave in the Building of a Nation. You can hear the horrifying context of that passage and how it fits into the larger history of our country right now. Professor Berry, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
You know, the beauty of that reading, talking about Charles Ball, is that we're hearing his voice, hearing the slave's story from the slave's own perspective is truly incredible. How did you do that?
Well, for me, so much of the scholarship on slavery used enslaved people as objects. So they were almost props on a stage. They were sort of part of the story, but not really the central part. And I wanted to know what the enslaved thought, what they felt from their words. And so I spent time looking through archives, over 10 years of research, just trying to find places where I could find their voices, whether it was a slave narrative that had been published, whether it was an interview, a newspaper article where somebody asked an enslaved person a question. Anytime I could find their voices and their names and their stories, I tried to put that in the book.
The thing when you're reading your book, there are two things happening. On the one hand, you make the enslaved real, and you make them real by using their words, their voices. On the other hand, you also see how, as you were just saying, slaves in other books were props on a stage. They were property. And
Yes.
when you read in your book how folks were talked about on the auction block, how they were written about in these journals and ledgers, there is no humanity in any of that. Reading the descriptions of young children, adolescents. In old narratives, these folks were, as you said, they were just props.
Yeah.
But now they are three-dimensional, real, live people who had real emotions.
Right.
Here.
One of the things I wanted to do was when we look at slave prices, because scholars always sort of pepper in the numbers in their books, I'd say, and it was just sort of like background information. They'd say, oh, well, even if they were not books about auctions, they would say, well, this person was worth $700. I'm like, well, what does that mean? And that's what really sort of started my research. I wanted to know, what did these numbers mean? But I wanted to know what enslaved people thought of that. How did they feel about being treated as a commodity? Because what I learned as I looked at every stage of their lives, they were raised to understand themselves as human beings, because they were, but also as human chattel, as property, as movable forms of property. They knew that by age 5 or 6. So this whole W.B. Du Bois, a double consciousness, I would say enslaved people had a double consciousness of understanding themselves as a person and as a piece of property. They knew that their physical bodies were being looked at or viewed the same way we look at a car today. When we rent a car or we buy a car, we appraise it. Enslaved people were appraised. We look for damage. We look, when they were on the auction block, they were inspected. People looked into their mouths. Every cavity of their bodies were examined, literally. And just the same way when you leave the rental car lot, you're looking for nicks and you're marking that up and you're keeping track of that. Enslaved people were treated that same way. But I wanted to show what they thought of this experience, how they reacted to it, and how they survived and lived in the space of commodification. And that was really what drove the book.
In the remake of Roots, which is now, 30 years old.
Yes.
There's
40.
40, that's right, 40 years old. Oh, man. There's a scene when Kunta Kinte is brought to the States. I believe it's Annapolis. Mm-hmm. This scene takes place, and his soon-to-be slave owner comes in and does this really invasive inspection. The mouth, the teeth, the gums, grabs him in the crotch and in the behind and all these things. And I remember watching that going, oh my God, this is really dehumanizing. And it wasn't until you and I met is when I learned, no, what we just witnessed in that scene is something that happened. It was routine.
It was routine. It was almost at large public auctions. I mean, there's different ways that enslaved people were sold. So you have even the film 12 Years of a Slave. You see a private sale where they're in a house setting and there's different rooms and you can go in and look at enslaved people. Then you have these large auction sales where people are put up on a block, whether it's a stand, a stone, a piece of wood, and they're sort of elevated. And then sometimes they're taken behind curtains or right there out in the open. People are coming and touching their bodies, touching their chests, their breasts. Women were examined literally to find out whether or not they'd be able to give birth to children. So they would do gynecological exams on enslaved women right there, supposedly behind curtains, but right there in the auction. So it was very common, very, very common.
So your book, each chapter is a moment in an enslaved person's life, from
before
they're born to infancy, young adulthood, and then when they're older, and then even when they're dead.
Yes.
That even in death, the enslaved are not free.
No. And I think for me, that was the point where I actually added 3 more years of research, because I discovered that enslaved bodies were then, their cadavers were traded and sold for medical research. And so I do argue that even in death and beyond, they're still being commodified.
So let's go to the beginning. Let's go to before birth. Josephine Howell.
Yes.
There was something in here that just leapt out at me. She's talking about her grandmother. Her grandmother had 21 children.
Yes. So they would look at a woman and try to make projections on how many children she could deliver and whether or not they would be healthy. Infant mortality was very high at the time, so they wanted to make sure they could survive beyond age 5. So a woman's value was wrapped into her fertility. And this is important because slavery was defined by the status of the mother. So if your mother was enslaved, then you would be enslaved. So as long as they had black women giving birth, and they were enslaved, their children would also be enslaved. So it was very important, particularly after the closing of the domestic slave trade in 1808, to have enslaved women on the plantation and to make sure those that were fertile could continue to give birth.
The value of an enslaved woman, some slave owners liked having women who could give birth, and then other slave owners didn't like women who gave birth or even had children of their own. And if they bought a woman who had children, they would buy her and send the children off.
Exactly. So that was I actually spent a couple of years on that, because I came to this book thinking that women were valued higher during their childbearing years, because I had found about 8 plantations in one community in Georgia from my first book that women's values were higher. So I thought that was going to be a national trend, and that's when I started doing this research. Then I recognized that during the colonial era, actually around the American Revolutionary generation, there were differences in the way that the word breeding during that time meant raising somebody up. It didn't mean, raping somebody to make sure that they're breeding more slaves. So there was a difference between the 18th century and the 19th century about women's value. And then I also saw that barren women, and I'm using the term from the time period, also had different values. Some owners, enslavers, did not want women that had children because they couldn't do the labor on the plantation, or their labor was decreased because they were tending to children. So some of them felt like women were liabilities, and they'd say, I just want workers. Or if they had small farms, they needed women for subsistence work. They were growing crops. They didn't want someone taking time to breastfeed and do these other things. So some enslavers chose not to deal with pregnant women. And they wanted to only have, if she gives birth, I can sell the child, make money off of them, but then not have to worry about any decreased labor productivity. So this is an economic institution. Others wanted enslaved women because they didn't want to have to purchase new slaves, because enslaved people were very expensive forms of property. And they didn't want to have to spend that kind of money. So if you have women that are able to give birth, then that's additional source of labor coming into your community. But it's going to be like 5 to 7 years before they're actually starting to work and do productive work.
And that's
labor.
the thing that is compounding the horror of all of this, is knowing that slave owners who are projecting like, oh, I'm going to buy her. She's going to be able to have this many children. And at this point, way down the road, I'm going to have this many people.
Exactly.
Let's move into infancy and childhood. Rachel, sold at 1 year old.
Yes. I actually, scholarship in the 60s and 70s often said that children weren't sold separate from their parents. And I thought, I kept finding them as I was developing this large database of enslaved people's values. I had a column in my chart for years of age, age and years. Then I found someone that was 8 months old, so I had to add a column that said months, age and months. Then I found someone that was 3 weeks old that was being sold away from their parent.
3 weeks old?
Yes. But the day that I actually stopped working for about a week was when I found a 3-day-old baby in the auction block without their parent. And I had to create a column for days old.
How many more did you find?
Several. I mean, some of them, it would just say, like some of the columns, it wouldn't give their months, it would just say infant. And so sometimes they wouldn't have an age until they were 1. So even those that were under age 1, we had to go back and rework the numbers, because there were some where I knew how many months old they were, and there were some that I didn't know how many months, but I knew they weren't 1 year old. And so it was really difficult trying to figure out how I want to talk about that in a way where I can focus on the individual, because I wanted to give individuals their space in this record.
You just said a second ago that you stopped working for a week.
I did.
When you found that.
Because I couldn't imagine, as a mother myself, I couldn't imagine having your child taken away from you at 3 days old. And I couldn't imagine from that child's perspective, who's not even cognitive enough to even understand and can't even see straight, right? What does that mean to be taken out of that space at 3 days old, put up on an auction block, and sold? The cover of my book has a picture that most people don't even see the infant on the table. There was an infant. When you look at the picture, there's a mother reaching out, but she's reaching towards the baby that the enslaver is holding.
Oh, right.
And a lot of
I'm looking at the cover right now.
Yeah. And there's money on the table.
Yeah.
And so that child is probably, 8 or 9 months old, just looking at size. But what does this mean to be separated from your parent at that age?
So we started out this incredible conversation with you reading the words of Charles Ball.
Yes.
Talk about Charles Ball and why he is a prominent or a significant figure in your field of study.
So Charles Ball is important because we have a narrative from his perspective. He's not part of the Workers' Progress Administration narratives, which were interviews of enslaved people taken in the 1930s. But there was a number of published narratives from as early as 1825 forward, where abolitionists and other organizations published narratives of enslaved people once they received their freedom. So Charles Ball is like Frederick Douglass. We have a number of other enslaved narratives that the general population may or may not have heard of. Scholars, historians, we use these narratives all the time. And so he's one of many enslaved people. But he talks about his recollections with Sale. He talks about his recollection of the separation from his mother. And that's a very vivid scene. And one of the things I argue is that this moment in their lives when enslaved people recognize that they are property, it has a lasting effect, and these are memories that they will never forget. The average enslaved person was sold about 4 or 5 times in their lifetime. So this might be sale number 1 of many. And it's something that they come to terms with. That doesn't mean they accepted it, but they come to terms with it, and they know that it's a reality that haunts them for the rest of their lives. So even when they're taken away from their biological parents, they then have sometimes other parents that come as fictive kin or play parents when they are on another estate. You want to form a family. So enslaved people adapted by creating new families. But they always talked about the original, their biological parents. And they might have had, I have 3 mothers. My first mother was the mother that gave birth to me. My second mother was on X plantation. My third mother was when I went to this plantation. But I will always remember my first mother.
You write after Charles Ball this incredible moment where there is a young boy, maybe he's a teenager or adolescent, on the auction block, and there is maybe this is being told by an abolitionist. I can't remember exactly, but there is a gray-haired Negro standing next to him. The two of them are looking at each other, staring at each other. Each has tears rolling down his eyes. They are silent, but they have this fixed gaze on each other. And this leads into what you call soul value.
Yes.
Talk about that scene and talk about why that exemplifies soul value.
Okay. So that scene was very important for me to include because you don't see a lot in slavery that talks about fathers and sons. And I believe that this was a father and son. The paternal line is not always traced during slavery because mothers are the ones that continue the institution. So some plantation records might have, these are the parents of this child, but most of the time it'll say mothers and their children. And so it pained me to see all these fathers not being included here. And enslaved people had important relationships with their fathers. So when I saw this auction scene, I read this in a newspaper of a father and a son, and you talk about this gaze, it just seemed like a very powerful moment, and they knew that they were going to be separated. And I also felt like, I think the boy might have been around 11 or 12. So this was probably his first sale. This is that moment that he probably knew about since age 5. He'd witnessed it or he'd seen it with other people, and it's now his moment. And he's going to experience this. It's a very powerful moment. Now, what I call soul value is that I thought about there's got to be a way. There has to be something that enslaved people held on to survive and to make it through, to keep living, to find a new family, to find a new mother, a new father, a new partner. There had to be something there. And I found that there was a valuation that they had internally that is not a monetary valuation, but it's the value of themselves as human beings. It's the value of their souls. And that's something that they believed could not be commodified. This deep inner sense of themselves that enslaved people had. They weren't not all of them gave in to enslavement. Not all of them they weren't all in this melancholy state of depression. Now, they probably were a number of them that were probably depressed. But I wanted to show the strength and the spirit and the souls of these people. And I found it in these narratives and these stories. And I think that I had to come up with a term to describe it.
One of the ways it's sort of just in popular culture, even though this is based on his family's history, in Roots, to go back to Roots, throughout the entire series, Kunta Kinte ensures that he remembers his name, and he ensures that everyone around him knows who he is, knows where he comes from.
Exactly.
And that is how even strangers towards the end of the series, when he goes back to find Kunta Kinte's relations, this person was able to tell this narrative, tell this story that let folks know, oh my God, Chicken George is alive.
The thread in that is his soul value. And the soul value is something that can live beyond the body, right?
Right.
And I also talk about ghost values, which we can come back to.
Oh no, I was going to come to that.
Yeah.
Because that sort of brings us full circle in terms of even in death, the enslaved they're not free.
No. And so I term that ghost, the value of their bodies at death and beyond is to me a ghost value because they're cadavers. The frame of their being is being traded. And so I refer to that as a ghost value because they're on dissection tables. They're being traded through other spaces, but they're not there for that particular commodification. And, I was trying to find a way to talk about how the dead communicate, because we don't have a narrative from someone that's dead to say, yeah, after I died, my body was put in a cask and sent to this school and people were, cut me open. We don't have testimony of that. So I can only think about a space that's something that we don't have a way to catalog that. So I came up with the term ghost value.
In the introduction, and this is among many things that sent a chill through me, you write their research, the folks who were doing research on these dead bodies, their research provided a context for the discovery in the 1980s and 1990s of hundreds of improperly disposed African American remains in the basement of the Medical College of Georgia and in a well at Virginia Commonwealth University. Construction and later archival excavations led to physical evidence of the domestic cadaver trade that I describe in this study.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing because they're still trying to decide today what to do, what kind of burial and how their bodies are going to be laid to rest. And so They returned the bodies that they found in the 80s in the Medical College of Georgia, were put in a large vault, and they had a ceremony. They're still determining what to do with the bodies at Virginia Commonwealth University. Most of the chapters here end in a burial. Mm-hmm. If enslaved people could bury the dead and send people off at the end of their lives, what would they do? What would they say? What songs would they sing? How would they do that? There are still bodies that need to be laid to rest that have never been in a proper burial. And so these ghost values, slavery is still very much a part of American culture, American history.
Well, that gets to the next question I was just about to ask you, and that is, what do you say to white people who say slavery has nothing to do with me, or none of my ancestors owned slaves, or this one really always gets me, slavery was abolished in 1865. Why can't black people move on?
Yeah. Oh, my gosh. I get that all the time, too. So one of the things I say, and I say this publicly, anyone that's heard me speak, my students, I got probably tired of it. Black people in this country were enslaved longer than we have been free. And when you think about that reality, if slavery ended in 1865, it's now 2017, black people were enslaved for almost 244 years. We haven't reached the 244-year mark of freedom. When I also look at the fact that there are institutions today, universities, municipalities, insurance companies, city governments, who benefited from slavery, literally and figuratively, there's connections to slavery that's today. There are bodies that have been unburied. There are insurance companies around today that had policies for enslaved people that we have records from. And so it's not that it was something that was that long ago. I think our nation as a whole, and I've said this many times, hasn't dealt with slavery. And there's a story about this one female slave. I think this is her soul value. She escaped and made it to Canada. And when she was interviewed from Canada, she didn't want to give her name. She just said, put me down as Mrs. MRS, period. So she wanted people to know that she was married, but didn't give her last name. And she said, for those who want to apologize for slavery, let them go experience it for a while.
Wow.
I mean, let the enslaved speak. Let them tell us. Look what she's telling us. Mm-hmm. I don't want an apology. We have yet to, the history books have not incorporated the kinds of stories, the textbooks. There are historical scholars, there are historians that are doing this work, but we're sometimes talking to one another. I wanted to write a book that was for a larger, wider, accessible audience, and that's why I wrote this book. But I do think we need to do some reform with the textbooks, history textbooks. The paragraphs on slavery are getting better. But when I was growing up, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and then freedom. Yeah. Martin Luther King.
Right.
One paragraph.
Right. And those were always the most uncomfortable moments in school. I mean, I don't know about you, but I went to a predominantly white school. And on Slavery Day, during U.S. history classes, I felt all of the eyes in the classroom on me. And that's even when I wasn't called on by the teacher to read
the passage.
the passage or two, or hearing another classmate read these passages, and you could tell they were uncomfortable in doing so. Have you been to the National Museum of African American History and Culture?
I went this week, and it was amazing.
It is amazing. And we interviewed Director Lonnie Bunch for the podcast early on, and he had wonderful things to say, including making the point that folks need to understand that this is American history.
It is American history.
And that white people need to understand that slavery is a part of that history.
Exactly.
We all have to deal with it. What exhibit sort of crystallizes your work and what you're doing and the importance of what you're doing?
So there's a wall that talks about the domestic slave trade, and that's what my book is about. And on the wall is a sack that a mother gave to her daughter. And I might be getting this wrong, but on the sack, it's like there was this woman stitched something on there to tell her to remember her, and this was passed down through generations. That's powerful because this is something that's been passed down. Enslaved people had very few material items to pass down. But on this wall is also like the values and the names of enslaved people. They're sprinkled everywhere. And to me, it's important for us to remember there are so many nameless people who were traded and treated as a piece of property, but now are on this wall with their names and their stories. And we're now in a space where we can reclaim their stories and make them a part of this history and allow them to tell the story of how they experience life in the United States.
Professor Daina Ramey Berry, author of The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, The Value of the Enslaved from Womb to Grave in the Building of a Nation. She's also the associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of History and African Diaspora Studies. Thank you.